The sun has been hammering this column for 6 hours. Dust coats every tongue, clings to sweat-soaked tunics, fills nostrils until breathing becomes an act of willpower. Thousands of men stretch back along the road, their boots grinding stone and packed earth in an endless rhythm. Shields hang from shoulders. Pack frames dig into flesh. Somewhere in the middle of this column, a legionary shifts his load and catches a smell that stops him cold. It's coming from a leather sack strapped to a mule ahead, a sourness, a wrongness, the scent of grain that's turned. He says nothing. Maybe it's his imagination. Maybe it's someone else's problem. But he knows what that smell means if it's real. He's seen it before. Not the enemy. Not an ambush. Something quieter, slower, and far more dangerous. Bad food moving through a camp spreads faster than any blade. Men who ate from the same pot collapsing by morning. Strength draining. Marches slowing. Panic setting in when soldiers realize the supplies they depend on might be poisoning them. This is the nightmare that haunted every Roman commander, whether they admitted it openly or not. An army that cannot eat cannot fight. An army that eats poison cannot march. And somewhere between the harvest fields of Italy and a frontier 2,000 miles away, every sack of grain, every amphora of oil, every strip of dried meat had to survive the journey intact, or the campaign dies with it. So here is the question most people never think to ask. How did Rome keep food safe on the move? No refrigeration, no sealed packaging, no lab testing, no instant resupply helicopters, just heat, rain, mud, insects, and time working against every calorie carried. The answer shaped the fate of empires. Most people assume Roman soldiers survived on willpower and hard bread. They imagine legionaries gnawing stale crusts while foraging for whatever they could find along the way. Simple, primitive, almost romantic in its roughness. That assumption is wrong. What Rome built was something far more sophisticated, a system that treated food as a strategic weapon, preservation as engineering, and discipline as the shield that kept contamination at bay. The real power wasn't any single technique. It was the combination. Ingredients chosen for stability, containers designed to protect them, routines that prevented spoilage, and an organization so rigid that individual error rarely became collective disaster. To understand it, you first have to understand what they were fighting against. Food spoils for reasons that seem obvious once you see them, but those reasons compound with terrifying speed on campaign. Heat accelerates decay, moisture invites mold and bacterial growth. Time allows both to spread. Insects burrow, rodents gnaw. And the most dangerous factor of all is contamination, dirty hands reaching into shared vessels, one tainted portion mixed into a communal pot, a single mistake multiplied across hundreds of men eating from the same source. A Roman marching column was a contamination risk factory. Thousands of bodies sweating, bleeding, eliminating waste. Animals carrying supplies and leaving droppings. Dust and filth in every gust of wind. The margin between a healthy army and a crippled one could be measured in a few hours of carelessness. So Rome engineered for survival from the ingredient up. Grain was the backbone of Roman military food, and there's a reason for that beyond simple nutrition. Wheat and barley, transported dry and whole, are remarkably stable. The outer hull of unprocessed grain protects the edible interior from moisture, insects, and mold far better than milled flour or cooked food ever could. Dry calories travel. Cooked porridge sitting in a warm pot for hours becomes a breeding ground. Roman logistics favored the ingredient that could wait until the moment it was needed. Hard bread and biscuits took this principle further. Sources suggest soldiers often carried a form of twice-baked bread, dense and dry, the moisture driven out by repeated heating. Dryness is defense. What cannot absorb moisture cannot easily host the organisms that cause rot. These weren't pleasant to eat, they required soaking or chewing with considerable effort, but they didn't betray you on the 7th day of a march. Pulses played a similar role. Dried beans and lentils packed nutrition into a form that could survive months without spoiling if kept dry. Combined with grain, they created a caloric base that didn't demand refrigeration or constant supervision. The pattern is consistent. Roman military food was selected for stability first, taste second. Salt and smoke were applied where circumstances allowed. Cured meats and preserved fish appear in records and archaeological contexts. though the extent varied by region, season, and supply lines. Cheese and fermented products offered another category of foods that traveled better than their fresh counterparts precisely because the preservation process had already occurred. What most people miss is that this wasn't random folk wisdom, it was selection pressure across centuries of campaigning. Foods that failed armies got replaced by foods that didn't. Olive oil deserves special mention. It served as both calorie source and cooking medium, but its value ran deeper. Oil kept grain and other dried goods from absorbing moisture when used as a coating or barrier. Vinegar added sharpness to bland rations and, according to Roman sources, made questionable water more palatable when mixed in small amounts. Wine served as morale, reward, and practical utility, though claims about its ability to purify water should be treated with caution. What mattered most was that these liquids, properly sealed, outlasted the foods that spoiled fastest. But ingredients mean nothing if the containers fail. This is where Rome's overlooked engineering shines. Amphorae are the iconic image, those tall, tapered ceramic jars that appear on shipwrecks and excavation sites across 3 continents. Their shape wasn't decorative. The pointed base allowed them to be wedged into sand or stacked in racks without rolling. The narrow neck limited exposure to air and contamination. Many were lined with pitch or resin, creating a seal that kept moisture out and contents stable for months of transport. Beyond amphorae, Roman supply systems used barrels in some regions, leather sacks treated for water resistance, wooden boxes for high-value items, and woven baskets lined with cloth or leather to separate contents from external humidity. The container was part of preservation, not an afterthought. Archaeological evidence from military sites reveals careful attention to storage. Vessels kept off wet ground, sometimes on raised platforms or in ventilated structures designed to prevent moisture seepage. Keeping pests out mattered as much as keeping moisture out. A single rat accessing a grain store could contaminate far more than it consumed. Weevils could destroy supplies from within if eggs already present in harvested grain hatched during transport. Solutions varied, but the principle was consistent: vigilance at every stage. When the marching day ended and fires lit, the cooking phase introduced new risks. Here is where routine saved lives. Roman military cooking, by most evidence, emphasized immediate consumption. Grain was ground or pounded, mixed with water, and cooked into porridge or baked into simple cakes that were eaten within hours of preparation. The logic is simple but powerful. Hot food, freshly made and consumed immediately, carries far less risk than food cooked in the morning and left to sit through a warm afternoon. Boiling also rendered questionable water safer and made dried pulses digestible. There's a critical point here that most histories overlook. The discipline wasn't just about cooking correctly. It was about cooking in small batches, consuming completely, never letting cooked food linger. This required organization, knowing how many men needed to eat, portioning ingredients accordingly, timing preparation so that distribution happened immediately. It sounds mundane. It prevented catastrophe. Water itself was a gamble. Roman armies sought clean sources when possible, but clean was relative and often unknowable. The practice of mixing small amounts of vinegar or wine with water appears repeatedly in sources, and while the temptation is to claim this purified the water, the safer interpretation is that it made water more palatable and perhaps discouraged certain visible growths. Roman soldiers didn't understand microbiology, but their practices, evolved over generations, reduced risk through habits they couldn't fully explain. Now, here is the reveal that changes how you see Roman power. Every technique described so far could be known by any culture. Drying food, salting meat, using sealed jars, none of this was uniquely Roman. What was uniquely Roman was the system that ensured these practices happened consistently, across thousands of men, across months of campaigning, in conditions designed to make everything fail. Standard rations meant predictability. Sources suggest daily allotments of grain, sometimes supplemented by other provisions, distributed through a chain of accountability. Soldiers didn't scrounge for their own food most of the time. They received measured portions from a system designed to prevent both shortage and hoarding. Hoarding was dangerous. Food stashed privately in packs lacked the storage conditions of the main supply train and spoiled faster. threatening the individual and potentially spreading contamination when shared. The baggage train was a rolling infrastructure. Pack animals, wagons where terrain allowed, organized columns of supply carrying the food, equipment, and tools that kept the army alive. This wasn't a casual afterthought, it was a strategic asset protected by armed guards, positioned in the marching order to balance accessibility with defense. The loss of a baggage train could end a campaign faster than any battle. Fortified camps mattered beyond defense. Every night on campaign, Roman armies constructed defensive positions, and within those positions, supplies were stored according to routines designed to prevent spoilage. Grain kept separate from waste, containers positioned for drainage and airflow, access controlled to prevent tampering or theft. At more permanent bases and supply depots, granaries were engineered with raised floors to prevent moisture seepage, ventilated walls to reduce humidity, and roofs to protect against rain. These structures appear in archaeological records across Roman territories, physical evidence of a system that treated food storage as seriously as fortification. The genius wasn't invention, it was enforcement. Rome reduced improvisation by design. A soldier didn't have to make smart decisions about food preservation, the system made the decisions for him and punished deviation. Foraging and requisition add complexity that popular imagination usually gets wrong. Yes, Roman armies gathered supplies locally. They requisitioned grain from subjugated territories, sent parties to collect forage, purchased from markets where available. But this was not random scavenging by hungry soldiers wandering off to find whatever they could. It was organized detachment work, conducted under orders, with rules about what to take and how to account for it. The dangers of uncontrolled foraging were legion: plants that looked edible but poisoned, water sources contaminated by upstream activity, ambushes targeting scattered groups far from the main column, and cohesion, an army whose soldiers wander off to find food stops being an army. Rome understood that discipline in food gathering protected both supply, safety, and military survival. How do we know any of this? The evidence is imperfect, but it exists. Roman authors, from military manuals to casual references in letters and histories, discuss rations, grain allowances, camp routines, and supply problems. Writers like Vegetius, Josephus, and others mention specifics about what soldiers ate, how supplies moved, and what happened when systems failed. These are not complete blueprints, they're fragments, shaped by their authors' purposes, but they sketch a picture of deliberate organization. Archaeology fills some gaps. Military sites across former Roman territories yield granaries, amphorae, storage pits, and transport containers. Excavations reveal the physical infrastructure of food logistics, raised floors of granaries, distributions of amphorae at frontier forts, carbonized remains of grain and other provisions. Scholars piece together patterns, always with caution about drawing overly precise conclusions from incomplete evidence. What we can say is that the picture consistently points towards system rather than accident. The same storage designs appear across vast distances. The same container types move along military supply route. The same principles of dryness, separation, and control appear wherever the evidence allows examination. Now imagine this. A storm rolls in faster than the scouts predicted. Rain hammers the marching column, turning the road to mud, soaking packs and animals and men alike. Somewhere in the baggage train, water seeps into grain sacks. By the time the column halts and shelter is established, the damage is done, or rather, it's beginning. This is where spoilage becomes irreversible. Damp grain, trapped in its sack, will begin to mold within days if not dried. One batch of moldy grain mixed into porridge can spread illness through an entire century. Officers face a brutal calculus: halt and dry the compromised stores, losing precious time, or push forward and hope the damage is limited. Roman routine offered answers, imperfect but functional. Separation: identify the wet sacks immediately and isolate them from dry stores. Prioritization: consume the compromised grain first if it's still safe, before mold sets in, rather than saving it until it's ruined. Drying: when halted, spread grain to air and sun where possible, even if this means slower march preparation. Stricter control: if supply is threatened, ration distribution tightens to ensure nothing is wasted. None of this guaranteed survival. But the existence of protocols meant the difference between a problem and a disaster. Armies that expected everything to go right collapsed when it didn't. Roman armies expected things to go wrong and prepared responses in advance. Here is what most people never realize about Roman military dominance. The legions are remembered for their discipline in battle, their engineering, their roads and walls and siege engines. But none of that mattered if soldiers arrived too weak to fight. The Roman advantage wasn't just weapons, it was calories delivered safely to the front. An army that eats reliably marches reliably. An army that marches reliably can dictate when and where battles occur. The enemy can't outrun logistics. Every glamorous story of Roman conquest rests on a foundation of grain sacks that didn't rot, amphorae that didn't crack, discipline that didn't lapse, and routines that didn't fail. The soldier who won the battle ate breakfast that morning from stores that had traveled weeks or months without poisoning him. Preservation was only half the story. The other half was the organization that prevented contamination, distributed fairly, responded to crisis, and enforced the habits that kept systems functioning even when individuals made mistakes. The Roman Empire expanded because its food system traveled with it. Grain moved from Egypt and North Africa to legions on the Rhine. Oil moved from Hispania to garrisons in Britannia. Salt and preserved fish followed soldiers into territories that produced neither. This wasn't magic. It was amphorae loaded onto ships, wagons grinding along roads, mule trains ascending mountain passes, all protected by the same discipline that formed battle lines. Rome's conquest ran on grain, salt, containers, and routine. The logistics of calories converted into the projection of power across the known world. Empires rise and fall on many factors, but one of the most overlooked is simple. Can you feed your army long enough to win? Rome could, and the system that made it possible shaped the ancient world far more than any single general or battle. The next time you see an image of a Roman legion, look past the shields and swords. Look for the mules. Look for the wagons. Look for the amphorae and grain sacks. That is where the empire lived and moved. That is the machine most histories forget.